Welcome everybody to Business Monday. My name's Josh Fenton. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GoLocal. This man, cha-ching, Gary Sasse is the money man. He knows all, has done all. You name it, he knows it. Budget passed on Saturday, $9.9 billion. Chump change for a guy like you. That's like change off the top of the dresser.
I would hope so.
But what's your take on the 2020 fiscal year budget?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. One way, if you look at the fiscal soundness, it pretty much maintained the status quo.
Yep.
There's a structural deficit. Next year's budget, the budget starts in a week, has about a $26 million deficit in it because it's balanced by using a free surplus.
Right.
I haven't seen the state's official figures, but I would guess that the deficit for the next year, for a year from now, is somewhere in the $70 to $90 million range, and we'll see what they project for the 5-year forecast. So, structurally, there wasn't, much of a change, and we're really pretty much back where we've always been, where we have these annoying kind of gnat deficits, but it limits us from doing anything big. So I think that's the first point. So it's
A
structural.
better or worse budget than what was proposed by Governor Raimondo in February?
Well, it depends on what your views are on policy. My views on policy, it's a better budget because it did away with some of the tax increases. It did away with some programs where I don't think there was a whole lot of empirical data to suggest they would work. So I think the speaker should be commended. He presented a better budget. But I think in talking about the budget, you first have to talk about, is it structurally sound financially? And it's about the same.
Right.
The second issue about the structure, before I get into some of the policy and what the speaker did, it didn't make any effort to improve the way state government is run. The budget grew by about 4%. Inflation's running under 2%. There's no reorganization. There's no restructuring. So government, where it was efficient, is going to stay efficient. Where it was inefficient, is going to stay, inefficient. So from the technical part of financial soundness, of structural reform, it pretty much maintained the status quo. I think from a policy perspective, the choices that the leadership of the legislature made were reasonable choices. Everybody is not going to agree with each spending item, but if you step back or look down from 30,000 feet and look at what they put in education, look at what they didn't do that the governor requested, it's a reasonable budget from a policy perspective. No great game changes, but nothing that I can see that cause other kinds of problems. And the fourth area is an area that needs improvement, and that's the transparency of the process. We've made progress. I can remember when the budget didn't lay over for a week after it came out of the House Finance Committee. It came out at 1 o'clock in the morning, and at 10 o'clock you were there voting on approving it. There was absolutely no transparency, and really you had to pass it to know what was in it, as Nancy Pelosi would advise us. So the process is better now. After the House Finance Committee passes the budget, it has to be out there for a week before the final vote. And so you need to recognize that they've tried to improve the transparency of the process. But a couple of things became obvious this year. By the way, little things happened. There are major line items in the budget that are not easily identifiable. There's not a period where people can view the budget before the final House vote. And I've always advocated that when the budget's reported out of the House Finance Committee, it shouldn't be considered until 24 hours have passed. So there are issues of transparency that give what I think was generally a better budget than the governor submitted a little bit of a black eye.
Are you with Ken Block that there needs to be a line item veto?
Well, I think, yes, I am. I've always believed in a line item veto. I've written papers about it going back 20 or 30 years. But we need to recognize what a line item veto is and what it isn't, and what it would have had an impact on this year's budget. And the answer, let's take the $1 million that was going to the chiropractor. That's not a line item in the budget.
Right.
So it was in a $90 million item. There was no way any governor was going to line item veto $90 million to get at $1 million. So you have a real problem when you do a line item budget is defining what lines you're appropriating towards. And you can't include every grant as a line because then the budget would be voluminous. And so we generally looked at the budget of the personnel for a department, the operating costs, and major programs. And if you want to get down to the level of having line item control on certain items, then you have to redefine what you're appropriating against. And that's not an easy
So at the
process.
federal level, John Chafee was the deciding vote one year, I want to say 1986, blocking that the line item veto would be a constitutional question. And his argument was, not that this could ever happen in the United States, that you could get a crazy president with a crazy group of legislators who would then have enough power to eliminate things like the Department of Education, EPA, things like that. And that the president, with a small minority that could withstand it, protect his vetoes, could block and override.
Well, I don't buy that because,
We could never have a crazy person as president,
well, no, we couldn't, no. But nor was governor.
Democrat or Republican.
Yeah, nor was governor. But but people who sided with the line item veto, you're not taking away any power from the legislature. The legislature has to approve the budget. If the governor vetoes a line or changes a line, then the legislature has every opportunity to restore that line. So you're not taking away that power. I think when you put together a line item and you get line item authority, which governor should have? I worked for a governor that had it, and I worked for a governor that didn't have it. And
Lamar Alexander was a...
Winfield Dunn was the governor I worked for in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And I would when we negotiate the budget, we would negotiate the budget with the leadership of the assembly, and we would agree on the budget. And then there would be a bunch of items that we wouldn't agree on.
Right.
And they were told, yeah, if you want to put those items in the budget, we can't guarantee anything. Governor may let it stay, may take it out. And so what they did, they play games. They included things above, below the line. That politically we couldn't line item veto. So but the threat, the value of the line item veto wasn't the actual use of the line item veto in my experience. It was when we sat down with the legislature and negotiated the Tennessee budget, there was a threat that we would use a line item veto. And so that gave us a little more leverage in the discussions. In terms of the actual use, it wasn't a game changer, though Charlie Baker's made good use of it there.
Mm-hmm.
The governor should have a line item veto. 44 governors have a line item veto. But when you do the line item veto and expect it to be effective, you also have to understand how the budget is structured and what lines you can appropriate against. Some governors can not, if they choose to, they can reduce a line. They don't have to veto the entire line. So if we had a line item veto in the state where the governor could reduce the amount and that $1 million was embedded in $90 million,
right,
the governor could veto $1 million out of that. So the devil really is in the details, but the basic principle is sound. We do need, the governor should have a line item veto, and that would also help to kind of equalize the power between the branches, which right now is heavily weighted towards the legislative branch.
Did the governor make a mistake by not reaching some level of consensus, or at least have a discussion before even introducing the budget? It seemed to be such a disconnect between what the legislature historically looked at as well. There's been some unintended consequences. Today we broke a story, New England Tech is laying off 11 administrators. The school said it's related to demographic changes. Others within the organization who've been let go tell us that it's somewhat tied to promise, that they've lost students that they would have gotten otherwise who were able to go to CCRI for free. The extension of promise to Rhode Island College seemed to be kind of a dead-on-arrival type of proposal, and just seemed to be a disconnect between the governor's priorities and where the legislature is.
Well, I would answer the question this way. I don't think it was the governor's responsibility to have the legislature come in and be a partner in structuring the governor's budget.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly giving briefings ahead of time is reasonable. I'm sure that was done, but there also needs to be some kind of political sensitivity. And so when the governor submitted her budget and made a change in the speaker's #1 priority of phasing back how quickly we reduced the motor vehicle tax, well, that was politically very naive. Why would you do that unless you wanted to start an argument? And once you start that argument, you're going to lose because once the governor submits the budget, they have it. It's
By
theirs.
the way, a year earlier, she was taking credit for it while running for re-election,
Well,
that she She was really the mastermind behind this
Well,
effort.
then and now same thing on the Promise program. Legislation sent plenty of signals that they were concerned. The Promise program, though, raises another question about the quality of government. This is not to speak on the merits or the demerits of the Promise program, but where was the transparency and where was the research? Because for every budget action is a reaction, and so if you and like in any market. So if you subsidize something in one place, how does it impact the areas where you're not subsidizing?
Right.
And that goes to enrollment at Rhode Island College. And mysteriously, at the last minute, they put $600,000 more in the Rhode Island College budget. Now, I don't know what caused the shortfall there, the need there, but one can speculate that they were counting on Promise money that didn't come through to balance their budget, which was very short-sighted. The thing you mentioned with New England Tech. And so the Promise program, once you get past the sound bites of what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, but actually, doing a deep dive into the impacts on the kids, the affordability of college, their parents, the impact on other universities or colleges, both private and public, by the way, because we have a vigorous, private sector. I work at Brown University;
Right.
It's very vigorous, but there are others. You have to really understand, what the impact is on education as an economic entity, and I don't ever think that was done. I think this was more, soundbite, sounded good, probably worthwhile, but like I say, in any kind of economic analysis, there's utility, and we never figured out what the utility was on the other side.
Has David Dooley sent you a fruit basket for your effort to support a separate board of trustees for the University of Rhode Island?
No,
The
'cause-
speaker said that the reason why it was in the budget was in part because Gary Sasse said a couple weeks ago right here, in that very chair, that it was the number one most important economic development
And it will be.
matter before the legislature this session.
It will be because
And nothing from Dave Dooley.
well, no, nothing.
He has sent nothing.
No, because we have an arm's length relationship. Besides, I have been speaking about a separate board of trustees for URI before Dave Dooley knew where Rhode Island was. So,
Well, he was in his
In Montana somewhere.
Mecca in Montana.
Yeah.
I still think it would be common courtesy for Dave Dooley to
no.
send you
No,
a significant, maybe the ones dipped in chocolate
No,
too.
no, no,
Yes,
no, no,
yes.
no, no, no. This is arm's length, no gifts, nothing I have to report to any ethics groups, nothing.
The ethics officer here at GoLocal
Oh, I said, that's not, don't need that.
being bought off by university
Don't-
presidents for
don't-
your
don't-
opinion.
Don't even want a free basketball ticket, just want to be left alone.
I'll buy my own, gosh
That's
darn it.
damn right.
Was there any surprises in the budget that you did not anticipate or were surprised that they followed through on it?
No, no.
Unusual on 195, is it just a reaction of the delay tactic of the Elorza administration that they lost complete control over the entire 25 acres?
Well, I don't know about delayed reaction, but I think it's a classic case of the Senate president representing an interest group that was who was petarded by not getting those jobs and $300 million projects in the trade unions.
Yeah.
And this is something that is an issue that you really have to value in terms of the governance structure. I understand, don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand the frustration with the people who want to see development and investment in the state and the slow process the city went through. I also understand that people live in communities, and sometimes you don't make the most efficient or the most economically beneficial decision because there are other community values that you consider more important than dollars. It's like Donald Trump, speaking about, well, it's a good idea to sell arms to the Saudis because their money's good.
Right.
Well, I think the analogy holds here. The project will generate many jobs in the trades. Will generate $300 million in investment in the city, but do the neighbors, do the community, what's the intangible values that they have? And I'm a strong proponent of government closest to the people, government is best. I think the state was well advised in the 1950s when they amended the Constitution to provide for home rule. And now we see home rule slowly slipping away. We saw home rule, and that's one of the downsides of the session as far as I'm concerned. We see the Evergreen Bill,
Yeah.
interference in, of contracts.
So the Evergreen 195, and also on marijuana on the Compassion Center.
Yeah, that was a difficult one. That's part of the transparency, problem. So there were a number of issues, where home rule and local control needed to be balanced with statewide objectives. And this year, the pendulum, I think, went in one direction. Maybe next year it'll go back in the other direction. What's happening in Providence on the school takeover, you can argue it's needed when you look at the results in Providence. But on the other hand, if the state is going to step up and intervene, then Daddy Warbucks needs to come by and put a few
Absolutely.
dollars into this thing.
Blake Filippi got some good reviews. Had been very quiet his first year in the as the House Minority Leader, but seemed to kind of assert himself quietly and appropriately, and also demonstrated being the minority party and raising issues appropriately and respectfully. There was no shoe pounding on the podium.
Yeah,
Your thoughts?
Oh, I think Blake did a very good job. The Republican Party needs to reestablish its credibility, and you don't reestablish credibility by being a screamer. Sometimes you have to scream and draw attention to issues. That's part of the loyal opposition's responsibility. But you also need to be businesslike. You need to demonstrate that you can you get things done and work with others. So I think that was well done.
Does he separate himself in the Republican Party, the future of the Republican Party? He's now got a platform. He demonstrated leadership. Does he begin to come out of this apocalypse of Republican standing in Rhode Island and emerge as a...
Well, 3 or 4 years is a long time from now. He'll get another session. I don't know what his personal political aims are or ambitions, but certainly he has a platform and a podium from which
Listen,
to
all I
speak.
know is this. The last 38-year-old House Minority Leader in the state of Rhode Island was one John Chafee, I believe in 1960.
Oh,
You
well,
can hold me to that.
and it was a different Republican Party in
I'm
1960.
just saying.
No, that's an
Might have been a more morbid Republican Party in Rhode
No,
Island.
it was not a more morbid because there were establishment people, and it was more of an Eisenhower Republican Party, which seems to fit Rhode Island. Right now, the Republican Party in this state is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the Trump regime, and you'll never convince me that, except for some communities, west on the western border, somebody running as a Republican with the love affair that the state party is having with Trump is well positioned to be successful.
Let's jump over to Providence. There is a old school, haven't seen one in 20 or 30 years in Providence, battle between the mayor and the city council over a new tax structure versus the mayor's proposed to try and create, the city council will say, a more equitable structure, and those on the east side of Providence will say, we're taxed enough, this is unfair, it's soaking the rich. What's your thought on the dialogue?
Well, from a political point of view, I think it's unfortunate. I think people would have been much better served in Providence in making a sound decision if the mayor and the council were able to work together and deal with the results of the revaluation, which does cause some shifting.
Yep.
And everybody's known this for years. So for it not to have happened, talks about the political abilities of both sides, and I think that's unfortunate. I think when you look at the issue, just stepping back kind of in nerdy fashion, the question is, what are the best practices in administering a property tax and
And you've got to be full disclosure. Any proposal that taxes the rich, you're not big
Oh,
on.
no, that's not true. No, I'm for taxing the rich, but tax, to feed the poor. But the proposal ought to have transparency. It ought to be simple, consistent. It ought to be procedurally and policy fair. and it ought to be as economically neutral as you can make it. So those are the standards, and by any of those standards, this proposal doesn't meet muster the way it is. Now, having said that, there's an equity issue. We've known, since Henry George talked about the land tax, 150 years ago, that the property tax is regressive. We've known that the best way to deal with the regressiveness of the property tax is to have an equitable, fair funding of public schools, which we don't have. It affects Providence. And so, because the ball is put back in the city's court, so the question is, what's the best way to address the question of equity for residences? And there are better ways, okay?
Yeah.
And one better way.
So the council though says, listen, we got the budget in the middle of May. In 30 days, we found out what the issues were. We dug into this thing. We've tried to come up with a structure, that is fair. If you let the mayor's proposal go through, the most affluent people in the city would have gotten a tax cut, and the poorest people would have gotten a tax increase.
Well, but let me tell you this, where the council could have had its, cake and eaten it too, because the point I was going to try to make was that there are better ways, more effective ways to deal with residential equity. And just two, for example, are property tax credits. Mm-hmm. So if you're a family of four and you're living below the poverty level, your income's below the poverty level, or 125% of the poverty level, we'll give you a property tax credit of X dollars. That's needs tested. I get a better value of the money that way. There are also ways to give tax exemptions. You can be exempted from a portion of the tax or the increase in the tax if you meet certain standards of need. That's much better system than trying to jerry-rig a total state tax structure, where you have these magical numbers come up. You get 40% on the first 350,000, and 28%, above that, without looking at ability to pay, without looking at different community needs. You can't tell me everybody on the east side can afford a $1,000 tax increase. And you can't tell me that everybody in a poor neighborhoods, shouldn't get some type of relief because of an equity issue. My point is that we should deal with the equity of the property tax, but we've known that there are better ways than to play around with ratios and evaluations. Anytime you do that, you interfere with the economic neutrality of the act. You can keep the tax economically neutral and not give the city a bad name or an anti-business name, or anti-middle class reputation by doing what I've suggested.
Well, one huge, I think it's been lost, I don't think we've reported on it enough. One thing that this entire process has exposed is the minute that it looked like it was going to be delayed into July, the mayor came forward and said, we don't have enough cash flow to be able to keep the city afloat during the month of July, which seems inconsistent with his massive surpluses that he's talked about in the past.
Well, keep in mind the difference, between a cash budget and operating. But I have, 3 words to answer that question. Tax anticipation notes.
Right.
I think they've been used in this country once or twice.
And in the city of Providence on situations like this previously.
So I didn't understand what the mayor was, talking about. He has a cash flow problem, but the first thing they teach in Finance 101 or government finance is to understand the difference between a cash and a budgetary problem.
Right.
He is absolutely, I'm sure he's right. I haven't looked at the numbers, but I have no reason to think he's not right. So the question is.
Well, I think Providence has both. Right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty clear that not only does it have a cash problem, even in the best of times, when property values are increasing, it still has poor cash flow. In addition, it may have one of the more significant budgetary stresses on a number of levels, both short-term and long-term, especially when you take into account OPEB and pension obligations.
Yeah, but the point being, don't say we're going to run out of cash. Say we have looked at all of these options to manage a cash problem for 60 days, and we have no options.
Right.
I'm not convinced that there are no options to deal with a cash problem.
Yeah. Your recommendation? What's the solution? You've been in these situations. You've advised the city council.
I think now that the council has raised and forcibly raised the issue of residential property tax equity, that it's incumbent upon the mayor and the council to work things out. if you would ask me, my advice, and haven't got into the numbers, I would, look at some kind of a tax exemption or some kind of tax credit on a needs-tested basis. So, what if you have a person living in a neighborhood with lower value than the east side, but the person's been very successful,
Yeah.
or has inherited a lot of money? Why should somebody who's making a third of what that person making, living in a district where property values are higher, subsidize that person? But you have to recognize that property taxes are so regressive that if you can give property tax credits or tax exemptions on a needs-tested income basis, that's great. We give exemptions for seniors in the city. I can't think of all of what they are.
Yep.
And so this is one more group. I would also like to look at the economics. What would cost the city more or less, and what would be more effective? Restructuring your entire tax system, or giving tax credits or tax exemptions to people that you define as needy.
You do not, just for the viewer standpoint, Gary Sasse does not live in the city of Providence, so his multi-million-dollar
I can't afford to live in the city of Providence.
multi-million-dollar
With
estate
these tax
would
proposals.
not be adversely impacted by the council's.
But I think the community I live in pays higher property tax than people in Providence.
Don't you have fire things and all those other
Well, no,
add-ons?
we don't have homestead exemption.
Yeah.
We have I think.
I'm Josh Fenton. This is Gary Sasse. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Tomorrow, Kate Nagel is back. I believe she's got rock star political scientist Jennifer Lawless in previewing the Democratic presidential primary debates that come up this week, as well as some other folks coming in tomorrow afternoon on GoLocal Live. If you haven't checked out the site since this morning, there's been a number of new stories up. Please take a look at those, and more news is breaking right now. I believe that the shooter at PVD Fest has turned himself in, and we'll see what the developments are out of that story as well. Thanks everybody for tuning in on GoLocal Live, Business Monday. We'll see you back tomorrow.